Thank you to Steve and Natasha in particular. I appreciate the chance to be a part of this conversation about housing. To all of you that have joined in today from your homes and work, thank you and welcome to the conversation. As I heard the national and local background, I was reminded of a history that we not only share, but frankly, we're all too familiar with. That is the prolific housing discrimination that took place for centuries and its destructive impact on communities of color, like mine here in Portland. They also did a wonderful job sharing Habitat's inspiring history as an organization born of social justice. I'm grateful for their efforts to ensure that Habitat hews closely to its own origin story and purpose. And I'm not only talking about the tactical outcome of housing people, but also the overarching objective of empowering all Americans to own their homes as an economic, political, and social tool to build a more equitable society. The question I'm wrestling with now is, how do we meet this objective together? What will inspire us to act and to act differently moving forward? And how can we get more comfortable with race, the characteristic at the very heart of housing disparities? Now, all of this sounds so heady, so let me take a step back and begin by saying that the topic of affordable housing has been an enduring fixation for me. As an undergraduate, I studied scattered site housing in Chicago. There, we thought deeply about the many ways that Black people are excluded from the wealth of home ownership. In graduate school, I dug even deeper into the concept of property and its bearing on the exercise of constitutional rights, and the many ways that we have financialized housing to our collective detriment. But this isn't just an academic or professional interest of mine, it's personal. I'm a fourth-generation Portlander. My great-grandmother came here from Louisiana. Other relatives migrated from North Texas. Despite the prohibition of Black people in Oregon's creation, they came anyway. They were a part of the 6 million African Americans who left the Jim Crow South in order to build a new beloved community. Today, I'd like to share 3 personal stories along the way, and I'd like to ask you to consider the real value of owning a home. Is it to provide shelter from inclement weather? Is it to offer a place to dwell when you're not working or at school or socializing? Is it a place to call home, one that deeply roots you in a specific community? I've set out these questions deliberately because they outline what I'd like to explore with you today. That is, the 3 ways of thinking about the work of Habitat for Humanity: shelter, dwelling, and home. More to come on that shortly. For now, let's jump back in time to 1981. The year that Habitat for Humanity started in Portland, in the neighborhood that I grew up in. I was 8 years old. I lived in Northeast Portland on Roselawn Street in a neighborhood called Walnut Park with my 2 brothers and our loving mother. She was a wonderful mom. Somehow she managed to make $1 out of 15 cents. I guess looking back on it, most would have said we were poor or we lived modestly, but I didn't lack stabilizing love or academic support in the public schools here. But one consequence of her struggle to support us financially was that we moved a lot, and one consequence of moving a lot was that as a tweenie, I learned to navigate the city on TriMet. This meant that I learned a new bus route with each new place to live. During middle school, I often took the number 8 bus, and I waited for the bus at the intersection of 15th and Northeast Fremont. That is an absolutely beautiful neighborhood. It's on the edge of Irvington and Sabin. At the time, there was no cover on the bus stop. So on cold, wet days, I would stand in the shivering rain, gazing longingly into the beautiful houses that were nearby. I thought they were so fancy, and I imagined that they were filled with rich, happy families sitting around warm fireplaces. In particular, there was a house across the street from the bus station that was a beautiful white colonial-styled house with Black trim. It was my favorite house on the street. There was a young boy around my age who lived there, and sometimes I saw him playing in the yard, and I'd watch him closely. He never talked to me, and I never talked to him. From time to time, I saw his parents, and we never talked either. They weren't unfriendly because I suppose there was always someone waiting at that bus stop. But watching him in the damp, cold rain, waiting for my bus home, that was an amazing experience, seeing that boy in his beautiful house. It was also the first time that I can remember yearning for something abstract, something beyond my reach. Of course, at that age, I did not understand what home ownership meant from a financial perspective for his parents, but I did understand the benefits that home ownership conferred on that boy. I can still see myself at the bus stop, a precocious girl who loved reading books, carrying a heavy backpack full with books that I had checked out from the Albina branch of the public library. But honestly, I did not think of the places that I lived as a kid as home. Those structures protected us, my family, from the winter rain. But I wasn't rooted in the neighborhood. The neighbors often didn't know us. The local store owners didn't know us. My mom, juggling the costs of rent and food and utilities, she was under a ton of pressure. The pressures that we saw, that we heard Natasha and Steve talk about: urban renewal, redevelopment, macroeconomic forces, discrimination. Those kinds of things pushed my family out and other families similar to mine by the thousands. At that time, I didn't know the words red line or gentrification or GI Bill back then for sure. But I knew firsthand what it felt like to be displaced. My point is that that little girl had shelter. She had wood, she had brick, she had mortar over her head. She had all those things that kept her warm, but it wasn't really home. In that experience, I developed a laser-like focus. And that focus had me thinking about the place that I'd call home someday. But let's skip ahead to 2010. And I want to turn that little girl's gaze around and explain how people began to saw me as I moved from shelter to dwelling. After I graduated from graduate school, I moved to New York. I rented a small flat in Harlem at 130th and 6th, and I was out early most days working in the financial services. I can remember the click, click, click of my heels as I headed out to the train station near the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. In that city, there's constant motion. Buildings were being constructed, there were orange cones, Jersey barriers, jackhammers making lots of noise. But among the hustle, there were kids who often waited for the bus across the street from my path to the train station. Hearing the click of my heels and with the sight of my briefcase, they'd often call out to me, "Hey, Miss Corporate America. Hey, boss lady." Sometimes they said, "Can you help my brother? He needs a job." They were so earnest and innocent. It would nearly break my heart every time they called out to me. Most days I was so busy, I'd just wave and keep walking. Every once in a while, though, I'd stop and turn and capture their gaze, wondering who or what did they see in me? What were they intuiting about my life with my high heels and my briefcase on my way to work at 6 in the morning? Many people know about Harlem, that Black writers and artists and musicians migrated to the city in the 1920s and 30s. Augusta Savage, Aaron Douglas, Beaufort Delaney, they were among the creatives. And like my relatives, they were a part of the Great Migration. They moved to New York in an effort to be seen and heard and to build a new community. When I think back on my time there, I'm reminded by a quote by Lilla Watson. She said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together." The artists of the Harlem Renaissance fought for dignity and self-expression. When I lived there, that fight continued to an extent in the many ways that I met the gaze of those kids who called out to me in the street. Our liberation was bound together. Funny, over time, their nicknames for me stuck. At Duane Reade, the local pharmacy, the cashier called me Boss Lady. At the bodega around the corner, he also called me Miss Corporate America. Somehow being nicknamed by those kids made me feel like I belonged, like I had a distinct place in that community. You see, my rented flat in Harlem offered me more than shelter, but it certainly wasn't a home. And that brings me to Portland today. Last summer, I was weeding in the front yard of my house in the Fulton Park neighborhood of Portland. My lavender was being overwhelmed by invasives, and I remember looking up to see a girl of about 8 years old on a scooter with her mother coming up the hill toward my house. And the girl, she was memorable. She was wearing a bright outfit, bright pink pants and a matching pink helmet. I had not seen her before. She rode right up to the house. She came to talk to me, dragging her black and white Vans to slow the scooter down to stop. I was taken aback by how she looked me directly in the eye and said, "Is this your home?" "Yes," I said. "Would you like me to cut you a bouquet of flowers from my garden?" And And she said yes. After a long conversation, I learned that she was partial to hydrangea. We talked for some time. I listened to her closely. I also recognized something familiar in her gaze. She had that same sense of yearning that I had had decades before, sitting in the rain at the corner of 15th and Fremont. She too intuited something important about home. She wanted a sense of permanence. In my interactions with that young girl and her mother that day, there's no doubt that I conveyed the authority of owning my home. My neighbors, as they drove by or walked by, called out my name. I know their names as well. So too do the shop owners at the corner store and the local dry cleaners and the grocery store. If the local school needs additional funding, I will be among the investors. If the cafe at the corner falters during COVID, I will be there buying coffee. These kinds of interdependent relationships, they are good for us all. I appreciate that we grounded our thinking today in history, but the question isn't historically why anymore, because we know the reasons, because racism, because exclusion, because fear, because apathy. We also know the tools: redlining, discrimination, deed restrictions, intentional ignorance, urban renewal, freeways. Framing our discussion only in the past allows us to avoid accountability today. The harder, more pressing question for all of us is no longer why, but why do we allow it to continue? We see the stress and destabilizing effects of racial inequality all around us every day. You don't need me to tell you about it. To be honest, I fear that we allow it to continue because it is in our own self-interest to treat housing as an investment for personal wealth, rather than as a vessel for building community wealth or commonwealth. The question of why we allow it to continue is an even more piercing question right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. We've been made acutely aware of two things about housing. The first is that we're all interconnected. Despite our racial and social economic divisions, we actually live together. The virus is spreading because we talk to each other. We touch each other. We've also learned that housing is many things. Housing is healthcare. Housing is a form of commonwealth. Housing is critical to children's education. Housing is the center of our communities. So let me end with this. My journey from shelter to dwelling to home confirmed for me that home in its most distilled form is community building. It's knowing and helping your neighbors. It's a long-term investment in the people up and down the street and all around the block. Let's not engage only in the charity of providing shelter, although shelter is important. Let's not only do that. And let's not only seek to build dwellings, because merely building dwellings in this system that we know perpetuates structural inequality just won't do. Instead, let us aspire. No, let us resolve to create the conditions in which everyone has a place to call home permanently. If that requires us to rethink how we finance home ownership, well, let's do it. If that requires us to double down on dense urban spaces like Lower Albina, let's do it. If it requires us to slow down on constructing urban freeways that displace entire communities, let's do it, and let's do it now. Habitat for Humanity is up for the challenge. They need help, so let's join in. Thank you.